Thank you very much for coming. My name is Kazuto Suzuki. I'm going to chair this session on the between openness, securitization, and the protectionism, the EU-Asia trade and trade practice. So this is the very hot subject. The trade today, everything about today is associated with a very aggressive language such as trade war, trade sanctions, etc. So there is a big challenge for the idea of the free trade, which has been the norm of the last 70 years. So and in order to discuss this issue, we have a very impressive set of panelists invited to this session, and I am very honored to chair this session. So let me just introduce our colleagues in this panel. The first paper jointly written by the Professor Douglas Nielsen of Tulane University and the Professor Bernard Hochman, European University Institute. Both are experts on the trade issue, and they have an impressive record on writings on the trade policy and mega region multilateralism. The second paper will be given by the Mr. Hosekli Makiyama, who is the director of the European Center for International Political Economy. He is also being have a very deep experience on the trade diplomacy, EU and the East Asian relationship, on the digital economy. And the third paper will be given by Professor Michael Plummer, director of Johns Hopkins SAIS Europe, Johns Hopkins University. And he is also have a long list of the publication on the trade issue. He has been working in the OECD, and also he has been advisor to many governments. And last but not least, we have a very competent person for as a discussant, Professor Stephanie Ricard from London School of Economics. She has been written in various impressive books on the economic geography, and this is another interesting aspect of looking at the trade and trade in a global landscape. So this session will be given 3 papers and 1 discussant, and each papers will be given 10 minutes for presentation, and then I'll ask Professor Ricard to give comments and as a discussant for 15 minutes. And then we'll have each 5 minutes response from the panelists, and then we'll take the questions from the audience. And for the audience, please use the Q&A button, which shows on below, and I'll pick up questions which are I hope that we would be able to have enough time to ask all the questions, but I'll be selective if there are too many. And finally, if you are using social media, please use the hashtag EU-Asia Conference for spreading the word on this session, and we'll be happy to have a feedback from you. So I have enough said. I'll give the floor to Dr. Nielsen and Hochman, please, for 10 minutes. I think Professor Nielsen, you're muted.
Indeed, I am now, I think, unmuted. I will
You are unmuted.
I'll present the paper, and then Bernard will handle any of the questions, and I'll try and keep myself quiet after that. So this is a paper that builds on work that Bernard and I have been doing for a while, and on subsidy rulemaking in the current environment, and in this case, looking at the moving forward from the trilateral subsidy rulemaking effort. The basic structure of the paper, if I don't get through all of it in 10 minutes, start by recognizing that subsidies are a big current problem, and a lot of those subsidies are intended to address domestic problems but have international spillovers. Then we introduce the idea that that what people often talk about as a China problem comes down to this sort of notion of how we introduce a non-liberal key player into a system characterized by embedded liberalism, which is not like classical liberalism. Then we talk about subsidy spillovers in trade, then go on to look at elements in existing subsidy regimes, WTO plus subsidy regimes, and then talk about how we might move forward on subsidies. So subsidies are increasingly prevalent. That shouldn't be a surprise to any of us here. If you look at Simon Evenet's Global Trade Alert documents, the majority of trade distorting means implemented post-2008 are subsidies, especially industrial countries, what we think of as industrial countries, post-industrial, however you want to think of it. A lot of those, it's less and less common to use border measures. Much of this in the past is related to activities of export credit institutions, export-import banks, guarantees, development finance organizations, etc. And these increase dramatically post-2008 as a response to the financial crisis. One of the points that Simon makes in the Global Trade Alert is that it was fairly, that a number of people have made, is it was fairly surprising that in that crisis there wasn't an upsurge of protection, but what there was, border measures, but what there was an upsurge in the use of subsidies. In the COVID-19 environment, what we're seeing is a lot more grants, soft loans, government guarantees, preferential access to inputs, protection from foreign competition on home markets, tax relief, tax expenditures, broadly speaking, what public finance economists call tax expenditures, equity stakes by governments, etc. This is just a handy picture to get a look at this. This is the post-financial crisis period, where you see, at least in the immediate aftermath, a fair balance between liberalizing and protectionist subsidies. But this is the COVID period, in which you see is just a whole lot less liberalization and a whole lot more use of protection. This is both developing and developed economies, and one of the things you see in this picture is developing economies have reached a relatively high level of use of these economic support measures, and in the aftermath of the financial crisis, the increases in annual increases in developed countries relatively stable, but what we see, and again in the 2017-18 period, industrial countries are doing the same. So how should we think about what's going on? Because one of the things about many of the subsidies that exist in the system that we worry about is that they're fundamentally targeted on often common problems and often domestic problems. And when we think about the distinctiveness, it's not so much the sort of one-line description of what they are, but the way they're embedded in domestic political systems, that is true of countries, the EU, it's true of the US, it's true of Japan, but it's particularly true, in a sense, we're used to dealing with those. It's particularly true of China because it is a distinctive power. So we need to rethink the approach to subsidies, both, as I say, to accommodate China, but more generally, because all of these subsidies, whether we think of them as domestic or international, if they're at all significant, have spillovers. There's an interesting literature in political science that tries to characterize the difference between national political economies. As the name suggests, it characterizes the difference between capitalist democracies, but it's easy enough to see China in the same sort of system. The main core of the analysis is that the elements of a national political economy are complementary. That is to say, they hang together. It comes out of more the business school literature, originally building on core economic concepts, and has been adopted by political scientists. The emphasis for capitalist political economies is on coordinated and liberal market economies. The key to recognize there is that none of these are classical political economies. The sort of Adam Smith, David Ricardo, Alfred Marshall, Jacob Viner view of the way of what constitutes capitalism is just not what any of these systems are about. And the business of building global liberal order is not what these systems were about, not what the GATT and then the WTO were about. The problem with the current WTO on these rules is not that they were blind to the fact that national economies pursue subsidies, pursue national macroeconomic policies, etc., but that the world has changed a lot in the 30 years since the rules have been frozen. As I say, China's a special case, but not incompatible with the rules-based system. It has a distinct economy, but its success, most specialists would argue, is largely a function of moving to market-oriented decision-making in the economy. There has been a strong orientation to exports, but there is also a distinctive use of state-owned enterprises. But it's important to remember that all of the countries that we're thinking of, that are the core countries of the WTO, have state-owned enterprises. We often don't think of them as state-owned enterprises. Power generation, education, healthcare, etc., are state-owned enterprises. And certainly subsidies are extensively used in agriculture, industries with large increasing returns to scale, the ongoing sort of constant thorn in the side of US-EU negotiators of Airbus Boeing should remind us of the same thing. And so given that no one has clean hands, thinking about how to move forward on subsidies that recognizes that there are perfectly legitimate reasons for using subsidies, and there are also perfectly illegitimate reasons for using subsidies, we need a set of rules that recognize that reality on the ground. This leads us to suggest 3 premises and 2 necessary conditions for cooperations. The premises, many legitimate rationales for government intervention to attain economic and non-economic objectives. That's sort of standard theory of economic policy lingo. Economic objectives deal with market failures, broadly speaking. Non-economic objectives recognize that governments have all kinds of other objectives that may be pursued through the economy. Attempting to impose changes in a national economic system is bound to fail, especially if the target countries are large. That is to say, hoping that China will become the US or Sweden or Japan is a ridiculous thing as a place to start. So we need to recognize national distinctiveness, just as we recognize that Sweden, the US, and Japan are nationally distinctive and pursue their own approaches. And finally, in terms of premises, a diplomatic approach is not going to address spillover effects well. That will turn every issue into a diplomatic issue, that is to say, a public power-related issue. And although there are people who are critics of the WTO that like that idea, that will do nothing but cause the system to bog down and collapse. So, what sorts of things do we need to move forward? We need to identify instances where there are potentially serious spillovers and have a greater use of economic tools and analysis as opposed to bright red lines, or what lawyers sometimes call black letter law criteria. And one of the things that we suggest is that the trilateral discussions among the EU, Japan, and the US really don't satisfy these conditions. In point of fact, the whole goal is in some sense to reform China or to isolate China, neither of which are particularly valuable goals. Moving forward, the idea is we need to accept that states will pursue a range of domestic policies. They will pursue these necessarily. These policies reflect the need to legitimate themselves and legitimate the market. And that is going to require policies. If these policies, as I say, are significant independently of what their whether their purpose has anything to do with trade or not, there will be spillovers. And we need to subject conflicts over those spillovers to technical deliberation. That is, we need to establish what the goal of the subsidy is and whether trade spillovers are necessary to achieve the goal. More to the point where the trade spillovers at the level and of the form that exist are necessary to achieve the goal. There will be trade spillovers. That's why we worry about it. If there weren't, we wouldn't worry about it. We need to distinguish between competitive spillovers from policies to address global collective action problems and market failures versus national industrial policies, both of which might be perfectly legitimate. And again, as I said at the beginning, this is not new ground for the WTO, both in the sort of general notion of Ruggies' analysis of the post-war order needing to take into account national active economic policies, but more to the point, there was an initial time-limited effort in the WTO to create a category of non-actionable subsidies in the WTO. This was the green box. That expired in 1999. It turned out to be unwieldy in the context of the WTO, in part because it was too narrow. It didn't distinguish subsidies that address global market failures from those that do not. It also didn't recognize this notion that governments have a legitimate reason for pursuing subsidy policies. Preparing so that then among the things that Bernard and I have talked about in other work as a way of moving forward, since a jump to a fully blown system is unlikely, is improving the information base and the analytical structure that underlies discussion of subsidies. The idea is to find a commonly agreed language for talking about subsidies, a commonly agreed way of measuring subsidies, and in doing so, move forward relative to the WTO by recognizing the value chain network nature of international production, and in that context, the role of input subsidies. The OECD has done fantastic work already in some sectors, in particular aluminum and semiconductors, and have been doing this on agriculture for ages. We need an institutional focal point for doing this. On the one hand, the WTO is an obvious candidate for doing this, but it lacks capacity. On the other hand, it does need to be a multilateral forum that includes, at a minimum, the US, the EU, Japan, and China as initial fundamental stakeholders, but it must be open to any other countries that want to participate in such an effort. The lessons from the OECD efforts to assess subsidies in different areas, as we've just suggested, can be used as a basis for developing a more general approach to measuring subsidies, and then from that measuring their spillovers and thinking systematically. Another interesting exercise is the Global Forum on Steel Excess Capacity. This suggests that the major players can in fact engage with each other. It also illustrates the challenge need of complementing data with analysis. So, when are subject? Do I have a couple more minutes, or should I just try and?
Yeah, please wrap up.
I mean, I can stop. I can stop at any point. I just didn't know when you had stopped talking, so I didn't realize when my 10 minutes were.
Yeah, well, it's already past 10 minutes, but please wrap up.
Well, why don't I just say the good news is, well, the bad news is we sent Stephanie the paper very late, but in principle, I guess she's seen it. Others can look at it. I'll just stop here. As I say, I just don't remember where we were, so I'll stop here.
Okay.
And I don't want to take time away from Stephanie because that's who I want to hear. So. Okay.
Professor Hockman, do you have anything to add to the? No, it's okay. All right. So thank you very much. It's a little tight, but it's only a 1 hour and a half session. Thank you very much, Professor Nielsen. I think this is a very interesting issue on the question relating to the governance, and I think the U.S.-China discussion in Anchorage was more or less about what is democracy, and how the China democracy and the U.S. democracy, and there are certain competition of the variety of the governance, but I think there is a sort of a similar comparative aspect on the subsidy issue and the rules to regulate the government-industry relationship. So with that note, I would like to give Mr. Lee Makiyama for your paper. So you give it the floor.
Thank you so much, Suzuki-san. It's a great pleasure to be here, and as one of the few, or perhaps the only Brussels Asia trade academic who is not under Chinese sanction, it is actually true. Everyone else I know who works in this area has been subject to sanction this week, so it's been a pretty hectic week. I want to talk about a more positive agenda, of course, around the Trilateral, which is a process that has been extremely important and also dear to me personally, and as a process that I have been following very closely since its conception. And I will basically make the argument that the Trilateral is a product of the circumstances and the timing that is fairly unique, and therefore very difficult to duplicate. And also I will try to illustrate what I think it will go forward. And the Trilateral Corporation for Global Level Playing Field, or just Trilateral as I will colloquially call it henceforth, is also very pertinent, I think, for the decision-making of the multilateral trading system. And once again, due to its unique circumstances that conceived it. And by all accounts, the trilateral process was conceived as an idea by Japanese METI, Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry, and who then approached the European Commission and USTR. And of course, there have been very similar configuration like the Trilateral. The Quad comes to mind during the, in the period between the Tokyo round and the Seattle Ministerial. We also have G7, and I will argue in my paper that they had their own deficiency that was not suitable for the purpose. But in conclusion, METI's idea seemed to be drawn upon the concept of the need of an alliance to fill the gap in various areas of multilateral rulemaking, in particular regarding digital trade. And as Japanese trade policy tend to think a little bit more long-term than European equivalent, they were looking at with a deep concern about how digitalization and connectivity and services could actually lead to rollback of existing commitments under GATT and other areas of the WTO pillar. So the absence of digital disciplines was actually where the conversation started. Now then, of course, 6 months later, going forward, we already had a slight expanding of the scope from digital issues and into, for example, areas around overcapacity in steel production, export credits, and subsidies that we heard about. And these are, of course, the issues that were on the agenda. And in addition, we had horizontal issues around transparency, non-national treatment, SOEs, subsidies, that also became much more central to the trilateral consultations. I should perhaps add here as well that the idea of these particular three parties working together is not necessarily new. The German ambassador to Tokyo wrote already a paper back in 2013 that Prime Minister Abe should invest his newly won political capital, the so-called Japan is back, into a trilateral cooperation, but on a much broader security-oriented field. Much less prominent scholars in Brussels also argue that if you wanted to have a successful outcome, especially in new areas around digital, you needed to have these three entities working together, because in the end, United States would need to concede to China in order for China to open up to Japan and Europe, simply because of the fact that the interests were symmetrical, but also given the fact that China's interest in vis-a-vis reciprocation was deeply asymmetrical. And I think I would argue here as well that I don't think it is entirely given that Europe would participate in this cooperation. In the end, alliance forming doesn't come natural to Europe's mode of cooperation. Europe in itself is a very fragile alliance that could actually be destabilized at any moment. But thanks to the involvement of senior officials in the Conte Cabinet Office and METI, who really sought to actually add on to the existing partnership with the US, was fundamentally important in order to bring Europe on board. And of course, we should bear in mind that the EU-Japan EPA would be concluded just a few months after the conception of the trilateral. Now, here's an interesting point about, I think, also Europe, is the fact that China typically consider Europe to be a demandeur of the second order. And another complication in this is the fact that Europe had also fortified its defensive stances on digital trade, particularly over its privacy legislation, but also because of its vested interest in traditional media, which had already contributed to the fall and the failure of the TISA agreement and the bilateral TTIP, even before Trump administration came into the office. So in other words, there has to be a slight change in at least the center point of this conversation in order for Europe to actually join the conversation. And of course, US stance on China at this stage had only led to conversation, the famous 100-day agenda with China, and the 301 investigation on IPR was already launched in August. But the 232 tariffs on steel and aluminum were just in the planning stage. And so far, Ambassador Lighthizer only expressed in media a general dissatisfaction over WTO and how it become too litigation-centric without actually necessarily shutting down appellate body just yet. And here is, I think, the dual nature of the trilateral. In one sense, it was already from the onset that even Europe could admit that there is no secret that we think China is a big sinner here, the famous word by Cecilia Malmström. At the same time, it also worked as a process where EU and Japan had common objectives in deterring and maybe even containing Trump administration's, inclination towards unilateral actions, at least when it comes to defending themselves. Maybe not necessarily other countries, but in sharing and objecting, avoiding the 232 tariffs on steel and aluminium. And it's actually not until EU agreed to direct bilateral negotiations over its industrial tariffs with the United States that we saw the first political declaration, a joint statement that came out in September 2018. So it took over almost a full year before we actually saw a political deliverable, and it was more or less conditioned on the fact that there was the internal dispute could have been settled. I would argue that these internal deliberation about basically US-EU dichotomy will basically characterize the entire conversation that took place in the Trilateral. But this division can be read almost between every statement that the Trilateral has produced. So for example, the 2018 paper will point to how the structural reform of the WTO is needed on its deliberative function, while carefully leaving aside any question around the judicial functions. And now, why the Trilateral? I would say there is a systemic relevance to this particular configuration, one that I have alluded to, meaning that actually these three in itself contain the most principally important dividing line that existed in the WTO, which is essentially, if you boil down to it, it's regarding the jurisprudence of international law. We have one party, which is the US, is not just a blocking negotiating party, but it expressed a very, well, a perspective that is very commonly rooted in common law, that looks at WTO as a mere enforceable contract. Whereas on the other side, you have a group of functional institutionalists like the European Union that more easily accept the transfer of decision-making authority from national sovereign to a multinational judiciary, as long as it rules in its own favor. And here's where I take the liberty of quoting Andy Warhol in my paper and basically paraphrasing by him saying, well, one is a company, 2 is a crowd, 3 is already a working party in the WTO. And so looking at the necessity of the Trilateral, aside from settling the internal division between the three, also we need to bear in mind that the green room had been abolished by the Director General Azevedo during this period. That basically meant that there was really no structure for providing leadership over the system. As a member-led organization, the DG and the Secretariat only provide management. There has always been a configuration, whether you call it a quad or whether you call it the green room, that has actually settled the most principally and existentially important issue concerning WTO. In this case, Trilateral took that agenda. And also, there are a number of reasons why this could be settled just bilateral between the EU and the US. I would argue that Japan's presence was a prerequisite simply because the transatlantic dialogue has been all about sharing values and the kumbayas, but it has been deeply dysfunctional ever since 1945. And also you have to look at the personality when it comes to analyzing diplomatic relations. Minister Secco and Lighthizer could form easily a bond of a conservative politics and litigations as the legal mind they had, whereas I would argue that Cecilia Malmström and the Phil Hogans that succeeded her were perhaps too conditioned by retail politics of Brussels to actually really get into their mindset. So inevitably, it's clear that Japan's presence was necessary, not just on a political level, but also on a technical level once the negotiation moved to Geneva for reasons I'm happy to elaborate. And for that reason, because it already incorporated the major differences between the parties in the principal question around the existence of the WTO, you might even argue that adding new members didn't actually make sense. EU was keen to bring back the Quad by re-inviting Canada, but at the same time, the current configuration already contained all the principal viewpoints around the 232s or the appellate body. And also Canada is not a major trading partner of China. It absorbs about the same amount of Chinese export as the Philippines. It didn't provide any additional leverage. So, of course, Canada would go on and form its own interest group around the Ottawa Group, but there's also a very important analytical difference to be made around Ottawa Group versus the Trilateral. Ottawa Group, as it does not contain the US or China, didn't actually have those dividing lines. It's basically shared objective is around maintaining the status quo, not necessarily in producing new papers or preempt some kind of a position for negotiation with China. So in short, I think that we can see in the trilateral process that we have seen some conditions, for example, around preconditions on non-exclusivity, and there has been also a certain amount of internal trade-offs that needed to take place to manage the expectations of all three. And the final product also is very much a product of these internal trade-offs. It acknowledged that the past WTO appellate body rulings undermine the effectiveness of the subsidy rules. And so you can clearly see that there has been give and take. And so my final question is, where does this process lead to? It's not entirely given that it can be replicated into other neighboring areas like connectivity or industrial policy. I'm happy to explain more about that, but fundamentally, it is very much a product of its circumstances, and involving more agency from EU and the US does not necessarily produce a better or more productive symmetry. It just confuses things. And the next addition is apparently not Canada. It goes without saying that it can only be China. If you have a joint position of the three, there's only two elements that could come into place. One is inviting China to the conversation, and two, tell China what the opportunity costs are. And I will actually end on that note. There are some thoughts around more internal deliberations and conflicts around US refusing to lift the pedal on the 232s, Europe engaged in CBAM and other, other new trade issues that it is creating. And also Europe's attempt to throw Japan off the trilateral by setting up its own Trade and Technology Council on a bilateral means, which obviously will not come easily, which comes with its pros and cons. But none of these matters will actually directly address the leadership and decision-making process of the WTO in itself. It is de facto the green room as we have. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very, very interesting. And well, in the security world, people talk about the Quad, but it's not the US, EU, Japan, and Canada, but it's more or less about EU, US, Japan, Australia, and India. So it's a totally different language that we are talking about in the shaping the global order in trade and in security. So that's another interesting aspect to look at. So the third paper will be given by Professor Plummer. So floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Suzuki-sensei. I like to show a PowerPoint that I'm going to get assistance with since we had some technical issues earlier. I just want to open up by saying that this paper really flows from the work that I've been doing with my co-author, Peter Petrie, on the economics of mega-regionalism in the Asia-Pacific region. That is first it was the Trans-Pacific Partnership until the United States pulled out of it, and then was reformed as the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement on Trans-Pacific Partnership, the awkwardly pronounced CPTPP, which went into effect in December of 2018. And More recently, we've got the Rcep agreement, which was signed in November. So these are very important initiatives that have, we would argue, very significant effect, direct and indirect effects on what's going on in the Asia Pacific and in the world more generally. And in this modeling that we've been doing, we're also applying them in the context of the US-China trade war that has been obviously very important for the region and globally. So this work is something that we have used to apply to try to underscore what the economics would be. And I think that some of the results are not always intuitive. So why don't we go to the next slide? Shall we go to the next slide?
Yeah, just a second.
Okay, there we go. Just for anybody out there who is not quite familiar with mega-regionalism in the Asia Pacific, the CPTPP is made up of the 11 countries that you see before you there, which would be on both sides of the Pacific as well as Oceania. And by far the biggest economy in that grouping now is Japan. And Japan is also a very important component of the Rcep agreement. And Rcep also includes China, but importantly, it includes ASEAN as well. In fact, and if we go to the next slide, actually, Rcep is an ASEAN-centric free trade area. And I emphasize that because given the fact that, you know, we all sort of think in US-China are these sort of, this grand competition approach to trade these days, we forget that how important ASEAN is. It's a very important player in this. It's an economy with 650 million people, 50% more than the EU would be. And actually, the Rcep negotiations really centered around ASEAN, because in order to be a negotiating member, a country had to have in place a bilateral free trade area with ASEAN. And so these countries would be in Northeast Asia, Japan, China, and South Korea, in Oceania, Australia, New Zealand, and India dropped out in November 2019, and which is very interesting. And I can talk about that later. But it didn't sign the agreement in November 2020. And what is the value added of this agreement? First of all, it has free trade area. It allows for free trade area in Northeast Asia between Japan, South Korea, and China. Now, there had been talks to have a trilateral free trade area, which never really made it that far. And there is a very superficial free trade area between China and South Korea. But what Rcep does is really integrate these economies. And this is where what we'll see is we get a lot of the economic impact from. Secondly, it levels this noodle bowl, because in addition to these bilaterals that ASEAN had with the negotiating members often had bilaterals with each other. And so you had a lot of inconsistency, et cetera. And so the Rcep kind of allows for, you know, greater transparency and harmonization of a lot of associated rules. It expands market access in goods and in some services. It includes about 92% of product coverage compared to 96% in the CPTPP. It lowers non-tariff barriers to some degree. Services liberalization, in my view, is somewhat disappointing, but it includes both positive and negative lists depending on the country. They're supposed to move towards a negative list approach after, I believe, 6 years. But we're not there yet. So there's not a great deal being done on services. It does, however, allow for cumulative rules of origin, which is an important part of that harmonization and will be instrumental in boosting supply chains. In the agreement, it had to include greater flexibilities for low-income economies in the region. And that is pervasive in the document that you see these sorts of things, for better, for worse, whereas an agreement like the CPTPP, there is no special differential treatment. There is nothing in the agreement on state-owned enterprises, labor, or the environment. There also isn't an investor-state dispute settlement mechanism in it. However, it does allow for, after I believe 2 years of entry into force, it allows for countries to begin to consider that sort of a mechanism. But if you look at it, a lot of the other areas tend to be, WTO plus or WTO consistent, for example, with respect to intellectual property and electronic transfers. Could we go to the next slide, please? Okay. Importantly, we have to consider what's going on in general in the Asia Pacific as this is happening. The Rcep was signed at a time of great stress. We've got the pandemic, the US-China trade war, and obviously the WTO challenges. I think it's important to note, even though we let the pandemic sometimes obfuscate what's going on, that actually international trade fell slightly in 2019. It was not a great situation even before the pandemic. So it's a situation, problematic situation internationally. And it's also taking place at a time of deepening economic integration in the region. And a lot of this regionalism is more market-based compared to, say, Europe and North America. And if you look, for example, at intra-ASEAN trade, what you see is intra-ASEAN trade itself has been fairly stagnant at about 23%. But if you look at ASEAN trade externally, you see that Japan's share has been falling, the EU share has been falling, US share has been falling, whereas China's share has been rising and other Asian countries have been rising. So you have this increase of economic integration in the Asia Pacific region. And the fact that this is the most dynamic region in the world is obviously very important for countries like the United States and the European Union. And so, as I mentioned, Peter, Petri, and I, we try to sort of capture these effects. Happy to go into detail, but I think it's also important to kind of look forward. And one thing that distinguishes the CPTPP and Rcep is the fact that they both have sort of open accession arrangements, that after 18 months, countries can begin to apply to join Rcep. The only exception is India, who could do it at any time. And so, for example, the economy of Hong Kong is probably slated to go up after 18 months. The CPTPP is the same. And so you have, for example, China that increasingly is saying it's interested in joining the CPTPP. This was mentioned by Premier Xi in May and President Xi in November. CPTPP has been translated into Mandarin, and this seems to come up quite a bit. So that expansion is possible. And you've had a number of other economies that have said they'd like to join, like South Korea, Indonesia, Philippines, Taiwan, and Indonesia. And most recently, as many of you know, in January, the UK itself asked to join the CPTPP. So it is something that is going to be going forward. So can we go to the next slide? Okay, just to give you a general view of what the economic effects would be from the study. First, we estimate that on a permanent basis, looking at beginning in 2030, the US-China trade war would lead to a contraction of $301 billion globally. And this is on a permanent basis. But if you start adding the CPTPP and Rcep to this, you pretty much globally anyway compensate for that. Now, not for the US and especially China, but globally it happens. And if you add things like China, the TPP, and the others, you end up having major benefits that go well beyond what the trade war did. Okay, next slide. And looking at it from an individual country point of view, Japan is the biggest winner from this process in terms of the CPTPP and adding on to that Rcep. Coming up at the end of this to a gain of about $100 billion, about 2% of Japanese income and beginning in 2030. Europe actually takes a hit during the US-China trade war. There's some comeback with the CPTPP, which is a very open agreement. So it gets back some of that loss. And by the time we've got Rcep, the spillovers are such that actually Europe is a winner, but $11 billion out of an economy of 23 trillion is not something to write home to mother about. Next slide, please. If you look at the effects on trade, and I'm running out of time, so I don't want to go too much into it, it is dominated by what's going on in Northeast Asia. What we see is that when we look at the effects of Rcep, exports from Japan to Korea, from Japan and Korea to China increases by 178 billion, and to themselves increased by 51 billion. China's exports to Japan and Korea increased by 96 billion. So if you add all that up, that is 2/3 of the increases in trade patterns due to all of Rcep are simply in Northeast Asia. Next slide, please. And interestingly, at the commodity level, this is really in advanced manufacturers. And this is why I think it's really important for the US and EU to take note that what Rcep will do is it really will strengthen supply chains and interaction in advanced manufacturers in Northeast Asia. If you look here, the big changes, for example, in total exports due to Rcep, China, out of a 248 billion increase in total exports of China, 185 billion are advanced manufacturers. About 40% would be the case for Japan and over half for Korea. So this is really about advanced manufacturers. Okay, next slide. So just to conclude, the trade war has been a major shock to the global system. In fact, I didn't show the numbers, but trade drops by $1 trillion. This is due to a number of things that we've also got a problem globally with rising protectionism. We saw some of that with respect to subsidies, but it goes way beyond that. I think it's very clear that Japan and the EU do need to work towards a reset at the WTO. The CPTPP and Rcep are both useful in going in that direction because in the CPTPP, many of the chapters are very cutting edge. The CPTPP is essentially the TPP without the United States. There are 20 measures that have been postponed, but they are relatively minor, all US preferences, but there are very cutting edge chapters for the chapters in that agreement for the global economy that could be very useful and are already being adopted in various agreements. And the Rcep shows the way in bridging the developing country interests, which we couldn't do at Doha. It was not an easy thing to have. In Rcep, you have advanced economies, you have middle income economies, and you have least developed economies. And here we've seen an example of how to break that, okay? Japan has obviously been a major player in both of these areas. The EU gains from mega-regionalism, but unfortunately it's going to be outside the decision-making process, which is a problem for the EU. And so it's very easy to make a strong argument for greater engagement. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Another very interesting and stimulating presentation. I think this is, in addition to the Professor Plummer's presentation, I would add that this is the Rcep is the first case that China joined the multilateral mega regional free trade agreement. And this is, again, another interesting aspect how this plays out in the framework of the multilateralism. So thank you for waiting, Professor Ricard. I'll just give you another 15 minutes for commenting on the three papers, and I'll give another 5 minutes for the other panelists to respond. So please, Professor Ricard, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Suzuki. It was great to be part of such an interesting panel with really, really great papers. I'm going to start with Professor Hopeman and Nelson's paper. This is a really rich paper with many, many insights and forward-thinking suggestions. So if you haven't read it, I really encourage everyone in the audience to read it today. One of the take-home points that I thought was most interesting is this idea to suggest that perhaps the EU, Japan, US Trilateral Initiative on Subsidies could serve as at least a talking point at the WTO with the goal towards achieving some sort of plurilateral initiative. And so that's a really interesting idea, and it's an idea that fits squarely in the theme of this mega conference. We have the EU and Japan working together to potentially address or maybe even solve some of the fraying international order that we're observing at the WTO. So it's a really nice paper. It fits squarely on the topic that we're here to talk about at this conference. So one of the ideas is to take this trilateral agreement between the US, Japan, and the US and put it forward as at least a place for discussion at the WTO to say, let's just use this as a starting point to talk about how to move forward on subsidies, because we agree that the WTO rules on subsidies are simply no longer fit for purpose. They were designed in an era before global value chains, before the rise of China, and so they're ripe for reform. And the authors make this important point that even a plurilateral agreement on subsidies would be fine because many of the WTO member subsidy policies don't create big systemic spillovers that would cause frictions in the international trading regime. So that's a good start. That's an optimistic starting point. It doesn't need to be the global WTO membership that signs on to these rules. It can be a plurilateral agreement. But the key is that it has to be involved with the major trade partners. And most importantly, China. China has to be involved and engaged in any sort of initiative that's going to successfully address subsidies, subsidy reform at the WTO, and really help to resolve the reasons why subsidies have become such a flashpoint in international trade. So the key question then is, how do you get China on board? Why would they come to the negotiating table? Why would they agree to new international rules on subsidies? What are the incentives for China to get involved? So Professors Hoekman and Nelson suggest a really interesting possibility, which is maybe you limit or threaten to limit China's access to the global economy if they don't engage, if they don't come to the negotiating table, if they don't agree to new international rules on subsidies. And so the question is, would this work? If we limited China's access to the global economy, would this bring them to the negotiating table? So Professors Hoekman and Nelson are optimistic, and they make a really interesting argument. They suggest that the Communist Party relies on economic performance to give them legitimacy to govern. They call this output legitimacy. And this is an interesting argument in a system where some of the other more traditional forms of legitimacy and other political systems are absent. The party is relying on economic performance and economic growth for their legitimacy. And this is leading their incentives. They need to grow the economy. To do that, they need access to the global market. And this may incentivize them to come to the negotiating table to be part of a bottom-up discussion about changing the subsidy rules. So Professors Hoekman and Nelson are very optimistic. I wonder if there's a little bit of reason to add some pessimism to the discussion. And I think this pessimism may come from exactly the discussion that we see on mega regionalism. So we have these push towards liberalization in the Asia-Pacific region, embodied by Rcep. Increasingly, perhaps we see China might join CPTPP. So does this offer China a plausible alternative to the global trade regime? Could they get enough economic growth from their neighborhood, from their region, through these massive liberalization efforts in the Asia-Pacific region, so that they have an alternative to the global trade regime? They have an alternative to the WTO. Does it give them an opportunity to eschew the WTO efforts to reform their subsidy programs because this massive liberalization that's taking place in the Asia-Pacific region? I'm not sure. This is a genuine question, and I'd love to hear the author's response. And perhaps the audience members have some other ideas about how to shape China's incentives in such a way to get them to be part of an initiative on reform on subsidies. Professors Hoekman and Nelson make really clear that there are reasons to believe that while China is a very different economy than Japan or the EU, there are some similarities as well. And so these similarities make me wonder if there are lessons to be drawn from the success of the Trilateral in reaching agreement regarding subsidies. So the Trilateral countries themselves hold very different preferences over subsidies, right? Japan and the US had big disagreement on subsidies. So perhaps I wonder if there could be valuable lessons to be drawn from looking at the Trilateral initial positions on subsidies, and then trace through to see how they ended up in this agreement in the 2018-2019 trilateral discussions on subsidies. So maybe this is a potential new paper that you could co-author with Jose, but thinking about how these countries with very different and desperate positions on subsidies were actually able to reach this agreement. And does that have any lessons for moving forward in reform? I just want to emphasize that one point that I strongly agree with the authors on is really the growing importance on subsidies for trade, and particularly services trade. Subsidies are now a major source of tension in the trading system, and I encourage everyone to listening, both scholars and practitioners, to think about doing really a lot more research on subsidies, taking them seriously. And I think the Professors Hochman and Nelson paper is a great example of exactly the type of research we need in this area. So Josep, thank you for a great presentation. I will send some comments to you afterwards when I have more time to digest this, but I think it's really interesting, and I think there's a lot of rich lessons to be learned from your experience and your insights, so thank you. Moving on to the Plumper and Petrie paper. This is a really interesting economic analysis paper. It's showing us or estimating the economic impacts of the Asian Pacific multi-regionalism. And for me, this result that just stands out from the paper was this large positive effect of Rcep above and beyond that of CPTPP. Much of the initial discussions surrounding Rcep, at least in the US or the English-speaking language sort of media in Europe, and the initial analysis, even by trade policy experts, seemed to suggest that Rcep was pretty shallow, that it wasn't actually going to do very much. But these results from Professor Plummer really call that into question, and they show no, this agreement, it does actually have positive effects above and beyond CPTPP. And so this is a really intriguing result that questions, I think, some conventional wisdom that's still out there. The results, interestingly, in the paper are conditional on or take into account the US-China trade war. Specifically, the authors include the Phase 1 agreement in their model. And so they also assume that the trade war is permanent. And I hope that's a pessimistic take. And so I'd like to ask what would change in their estimates of the trade agreement effects if the trade war is not in fact permanent, but is reversed under the Biden administration. So the authors very compellingly show that the trade war has differential effects on different countries. These trade agreements also have differential effects on different countries, but potentially are we getting a sort of less clear picture by combining both the US-China trade war effects and these trade agreement effects. The authors point out that there is this really important difference between Rcep and CPTPP, which Rcep includes these flexibilities for low-income countries. And so that's a really interesting observation. It's politically interesting. The authors suggest that these flexibilities for low-income member countries were necessary to get the agreement to work, which suggests that there's this trade-off that we've long talked about between the breadth of membership and the depth of liberalization in an agreement. And I wonder if the authors can actually see evidence of the economic impacts of these flexibilities. For example, is there any evidence that the benefits of Rcep membership is smaller for these low-income member countries because they have these flexibilities written into the agreement? The authors assert in the conclusion that this Asia-Pacific mega-regionalism should be welcomed as a breath of fresh air for the global trading system. And again, I wonder if there's room for pessimism here. This could be a breath of fresh air for the global trading system, but it might also be a development that offers China an alternative to the global trade regime. Right? We might have this big engine of economic growth in the Asia-Pacific region, which is excellent for the countries involved. It's excellent for the region. It's excellent for China, but it may allow China to opt out of being engaged in deeper reforms in the global regime. And one final point, I'm curious and I look forward to seeing your results for the UK. As you know, the UK right now is setting up their own domestic subsidy regime after leaving the European Union. And I'm constantly reminding them about their international agreements, particularly those that they may be subject to if they succeed in joining CPTPP. So I will stop there and again, thank the authors for these excellent papers. And I look forward to further discussion on these topics. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Ricard. So basically, you addressed the comments to two papers on the Professor Nielsen and Hochman and the Professor Plummer, but I'll give if Professor Mr. Lee Makiyama wants to say something about the other comments, please, I welcome you to do so. So first, 5 minutes, Professor Nielsen and Hochman would like to respond.
Yeah, let me kick off, and then if Doug has more, he can do it. So I think so thanks, Stephanie, for the comments. It's true we probably are more in the optimistic camp than what is now kind of seems to be the consensus view that everybody should be very pessimistic and very down and very depressed and very worried and fearful, etc. So I think there is clearly there's good cause for it to be a bit more pessimistic. I don't think we're necessarily optimistic. What we're doing in the paper is kind of sketching out a potential path to actually deal with the issue and argue that this is incentive compatible in the sense that all of the parties should be able to agree on these matters if we could keep the politics out of the room. And of course, that is a big question, right? So if you think about the discussion ongoing now on the comprehensive agreement on investment in Europe, kind of, maintaining that kind of distinction is always going to be quite difficult. I think on the on the point of does regional kind of integration offer enough to China to prevent a discussion on these types of topics? I think not, right? So even though Rcep, like Michael showed, there's a lot of potential benefits there in terms of trade, there's very little in Rcep on these types of industrial policy, subsidy type measures, behavior of state-owned enterprises, etc. So what that means in practice, that insofar as this becomes more of an issue in terms of being perceived as tilting the competitive playing field, countries will and have the opportunity to take action. And it really doesn't do much to deal with competition in third markets. Right, so that again is something where inherently you're going to have to sit around the table and work with other countries to try and get them on board. So I think there is a, to some extent it's a substitute, but I don't think it's all that much of one in terms of dealing with these types of tensions and these types of issues. And perhaps I think a more bigger potential threat to the optimistic scenario is that China is a very large country. Of course, the high growth rates were very much driven by this export-oriented integration strategy, attracting FDI. But more and more, they're going to be relying on domestic consumption. It is a very large economy, so therefore the steady state might be one in which trade is actually less important, becomes less important over time. And certainly that's part of the strategy that we see the government trying to pursue. And we see that also with the United States, which at the end of the day has become much more open, but still relies much more on trade than, let's say, certainly the EU or most small countries. So on the trilateral dimension, what you were suggesting is to have a look at to what extent you actually see agreement emerging among Japan, EU, US with respect to the substance of subsidy policies. And I think there again, my sense, and Hosuk knows this much better than I do, but my sense is that the focus was very much on China, right? And one of the problems and one of the tensions we had inside the trilateral is indeed that the EU is very different from the US, right? We have lots of state-owned enterprises, state-controlled entities. We are much more, I think, naturally inclined to be kind to subsidies than the US would claim it is. Although once you start looking at the state level, in the United States, you see subsidies everywhere, which are absolutely non-discussable, even for the federal government, right? It's just the way the US regime is structured. So there's huge kind of differences among the EU and the US on these areas. So I think what it illustrates is, there might not, it's really difficult. And I think if you start digging a bit into this area and you start thinking about what we need to be doing to actually deal with climate change, to give just one example, and how we manage the competition for high-tech kind of high-tech growth sectors and so forth, this is something that's going to have to be hammered out between the US and the EU as well. So again, it's not. So yes, we share common values. We're, both entities are market-based. We have common perceptions on China, but I think the technical dimensions and the real competitive pressures that exist suggest that, again, I would argue the Trilateral plus China are going to have to sit around the table to do this. And if China is kept out or China doesn't want to, we still have quite a bit of a challenge among, I would say, certainly the US and the EU to get to kind of manage these competitive pressures, right? So Boeing Airbus is a really good example where this has been going on forever. And, you know, we're not exactly there yet. So we're hearing nice sounds from across the Atlantic and in Brussels, but I think it really illustrates that this is a real issue. Let me just end with one question also to Hosuk. So I thought it was really interesting to the driver of the Trilateral in part being killing off the green room by Acevedo, right? So there is then this vacuum. So a question to you on that one is, so do you see that kind of dynamic being now potentially being used as a positive force to promote WTO reforms, right? And to what extent could China actually play a positive or a negative role in terms of bringing the US and the EU together on matters that actually are, you know, to some extent, again, quite different, like you were saying, in terms of the EU versus the US, thinking about, you know, what a multilateral trade organization is really for. Let me stop there.
Right. Thank you. Professor Nielsen, you want to add something?
I'll just make two really quick comments. One, the mention of local subsidies. I should suggest that Stephanie Ricard's work actually does look at that explicitly, and it's well worth taking a look at. Both the articles and the book are well worth looking at in that regard. On pessimism, I'm not sure that the major source of pessimism in the world trading system is Rcep CPTPP. I mean, at the end of the day, taking everything Professor Plummer says into account, it's still, in terms of risks that the system faces, very small potatoes. And the fact that the Biden administration seems to be quite happy to move forward with Buy American, with, you know, making China an enemy, and the fact that Europe seems, broadly speaking, incapable of getting their shit together at all, are way bigger threats to the system than China deciding that, you know, that the Asia Pacific region is just as good for it as the multilateral system. Stop there.
All right. Thank you very much. I'll just remind the audience to send questions while you are listening to using the Q&A box, so that if we have time enough, then we'll just go around one or two questions. So I'll just give the floor to Professor Plummer for responding to the comments, and then I'll give the floor to Mr. Lay. Yeah, please.
For the interesting comments very quickly, because we don't have that much time. We haven't sort of thought about looking at the impact of the flexibilities on these countries, which is actually a sensitive issue. When the Americans were negotiating the TPP, they didn't want to do that because they thought what's good for the goose is good for the gander, and couldn't do it. But that's an interesting question. But I thought what was interesting is how Vietnam handled it. Because when Vietnam started negotiating the TPP, it was a low-income economy. And it was entering into negotiations literally as a way of trying to guide its economic reform programs. And, you know, it was slated to gain as a percentage of income much more than any other country, with the US in it anyway. And I think it's also interesting that if you look at the 3 eras of Prime Minister Abe, the structural reform was also supposed to be about the TPP. So I think that really is a very important agreement, but I don't think you could expect Cambodia or Laos, and let alone Myanmar, sort of go in that direction. Now, what are the costs? I'm not sure, but it's interesting. I do want to mention that in a paper that Peter and I did with the Peterson Institute last June, we look at both the trade war and these things and business as before. So like a snapback to see what the effects would be. And there are differences, but not that big. But I'd agree with Professor Nelson's point that with the U.S. relations with China, it reminds me of that Who song. Do you remember? We don't get fooled again. You know, the last line is "Meet the new boss, same as the old boss." unfortunately, we see going, it seems going in that direction. And with respect about, China and what it does, if Rcep, is that's going to be really a breath of fresh air? That's a good question. I think that it's very clear that China has outmaneuvered the United States totally in the Asia-Pacific region. I mean, everything from the BRI to Rcep is very clear. It's gone that direction. It is part of the game. It's not the whole game, but it's a part. But what I think is interesting is China's saying it wants to possibly join the CPTPP, because if you look at the exigencies in that agreement, it covers everything that the Europeans and the Americans get upset about with China. And I think that when the Americans negotiated the TPP, that chapter on state-owned enterprises is fairly strong. And when they did it, they had to especially work with Vietnam, Singapore, and Malaysia. But they really did have China kind of thinking about what would happen longer term. Now, whether or not China would buy into that, I don't know. But I think it really is interesting that they've said they'd be, that they are considering it anyway. My co-author Peter Petrie is much more cynical about that than I am, but I'm a hopeless romantic. And speaking of hopeless romanticism, keep in mind that this whole mega-regionalism thing, and this is my last point, is sort of part of this movement that began, I would argue, with the 2010 APEC summit in Yokohama, Japan. And there was something called the Yokohama Vision, which envisioned a free trade area of the Asia Pacific, which presumably would include all APEC countries, but not necessarily. APEC's not a negotiating forum, but that was the presumption. And there'd be different tracks to achieve this. And one would be an advanced track, which was the TPP, which has already started negotiation. And then there would be an Asian track. And at the time, it wasn't clear what that would be. Would it be ASEAN +3? In other words, ASEAN plus Northeast Asia? Would it be ASEAN +6? That ASEAN +3, Australia, New Zealand, India, or to be something else. And that really became Rcep later on. And if you think of it moving forward, the US pulls back, that's a big problem, but you still see it moving forward, don't you? You've got Rcep and you've got the CPTPP without the United States. And if you go to this FTAP, if it's still very much supported by the private sector in the Asia Pacific, that really does become a game changer globally, I think. So that's an important, that's the longer term game, I think.
Thank you very much. I agree fully about the origin of the Rcep from the 2010 APEC Yokohama Vision, and I think it was Japan and Australia played a very interesting role because of this bilateral free trade agreement, which sort of becomes as an engine of this APEC, the ASEAN +3, ASEAN +6. And I think that leans towards the ASEAN +6 than the 3. So I'll just give the brief moment for Mr. Lim Akiyama for responding to the question that posed by Professor Hochman.
Thank you, Suzuki-sensei. I'll actually try to attempt to answer a few other questions that I think that has a relevance to the presentation I made. And also we have received a question in the chat that I think I can take head on. But starting with Bernard's question, if I understand you correctly, actually, do you mind repeating the question, Bernard, very briefly?
No, I was just basically reflecting on the green room point you were making, right? So that was then part of the genesis for the trilateral. And I fully agree with you that the trilateral plus China, essentially, that's what you need. So the question was, what role do you see potentially for the four of them to actually get together and deal with some of these issue areas through the WTO reform lens, right? So where essentially you're preparing the ground to actually get China to be part of that discussion. So that was, so in a sense, recreating a green room or a quad or whatever you want to call it in the WTO, and use the WTO reform agenda as a way of kind of getting at least the four talking to each other.
Thank you. Then I think I got it right. And I alluded to 3+1 configuration as the natural next step forward, now that the 3 has internally deliberated its position. And I also would like to reflect some of the points that were made by Stephanie around the disagreements on subsidy between Japan and the US. I think it was primarily between the US and the US, that it didn't necessarily understand what kind of its own subsidies it had, especially in terms of small business. And also I mentioned that the lead on the trilateral negotiation did move from Washington to Geneva as it became a more WTO issue. That also meant that some of the technical expertise, especially regarding China, was lost along the way. And I think that is an important factor to bring into the question. But also, it answered the question about China's preference, because it's very easy to see China as a constant. It is not. China is constantly evaluating its options. And I would argue that amongst the EU, US, Japan, and China, the one that has least amount of policy space at the moment is probably Europe and China. They are probably in a category on its own when it comes to lacking policy bandwidth to actually change direction. And as far as China is concerned, they do have a preference in doing requests multilaterally, but do offers bilaterally. It is a little bit complex if you think about it, but fundamentally they do prefer to engage in the WTOs because the price is much lower. Because whatever you can agree, even amongst the 3, it's going to be far less expensive than what you need to pay in, let's say, a strictly bilateral context like the phase 1, phase 2 talks or EU-China CAI. That goes without saying. So I pointed to the question of what can China do? I mean, it's really a matter of opportunity cost. So what is the cost of not engaging? China depends more on the WTO system than anyone else. Because of its difficulty in actually striking bilaterals. I don't think it's just a question about the classic narrative around China's protectionism and the difficulty in engaging negotiation. China also is a much more difficult economy to reform and to commit. And the fact that the central government in Beijing has a similar role as US federal central government in terms of what it can bind on behalf of its provinces. It's probably worse for the Chinese than, let's say, the US or the EU executive. And the question around TPP and Rcep that we received from Giulio, I think it's pertinent and really important to bear in mind that it's actually more lucrative for China to talk about joining TPP than actually joining TPP itself. There is a very important public diplomacy engagement that China needs to be engaged in to show that not all doors are closed. For a brief period when it was engaged in trade wars with both EU and the US, MOFCOM and MFA was very keen on showing that not all doors are closed, and therefore any anti-Chinese sentiment that flared up, for example, in Tokyo, was never showed on Chinese television, because they can't send a message that for Chinese businesses as well as Chinese people, that all doors are closed for them. It doesn't make any sense. So, but on the more positive note that I think Stephanie illustrated is that the experience of Rcep showed for the first time, at least for MOFCOM, that it can actually do some of these commitments. They have scrutinized the EU FTAs in particular and realized that the sensitive issues is more or less identical to the European Union, so that it can actually jump that hurdle. And the hurdle is not the counterpart and actually meeting the negotiating counterpart. It's mostly about managing domestic stakeholders. It can actually push back on the domestic stakeholders and do a trade-off that we can represent some market access in exchange for letting go of some of the fiscal issues that you're keen to keep on to. And the question around India and Rcep, it is indeed true that for most party, I think that non-exclusion of India made Rcep basically well, there is no new market access. Negotiators commonly joked about Rcep as the stapler. Basically, you staple together existing agreements, and it had basically one beneficiary, which is the ASEAN countries, who didn't need to deal with 5 agreements. They could simply deal with one simple unified rules of origin. And in addition, there were a couple of relationships that could be resolved. One was actually India-China, which of course fell apart, but also one is China-Japan, who due to public sentiment could probably not go into a direct bilateral negotiation with each other. So these are the other, let's say, non-quantifiable aspects of Rcep that we shouldn't forget about. And also bringing India into the conversation, I think it's important to bear in mind when I talk about opportunity cost in the WTO, that we have a much, much more obstructive power than Lighthizer or China put together in the WTO, and that is India. India has a completely different set of behavioral matrix where they basically refuse to engage. China has a very high price and they engage in a way that, of course, we would like to see a little bit more passion and heat and market access there. But in the end, China is engaging. India is saying no for the sake of saying no. And here's where I think a part of the opportunity cost is. Basically, to put it very, very frankly, everyone knows that the MFN is dead as a concept. The first one to realize this were the Chinese and also United States. Lighthizer had the audacity to actually say it and put it on paper, but in the end, we have all each on our end invented ways to circumvent the MFN. So the question is for China is that, do they want to be part of the new thing? It's not the new WTO, it's not WTO 2.0, but it is an alternative commitment in addition to existing WTO commitments that China can be a part of. And here it is really important to bear in mind that a very important aspect of China's reluctance to the WTO is that they were not a founding member. They can be now. This is the carrot. All right, I'm gonna end up here, but I'm just gonna end on one final point around, Michael's presentation around on the 232 and the trade wars and some of the comments that were made. I do my own dabbling in the CGEs, and I would like to apologize for the very poor attempts that I do and that I have published over the years, while I have a much more experienced people like Michael, yourself, that has produced superb reports on TPP, just outstanding. But one thing I will make here is that removing those costs from the US unilaterally doesn't make any sense. Because if you remove that from the US policy table, you basically turn United States into a demandeur. There is no reason why United States, even under the Biden administration, should give up these incentives to force other people to come to negotiate with the US. The price might be cheaper, but there is no reason to get off the brake. Europe, in a sense, is an adversary in its own right that is just as bad as China in the perspective of EU agriculture offensive interest and digital and also services. Well, basically anything that gets the US president elected. So yeah, thank you.
All right, thank you very much. The time is already up, but is there anyone who wants to respond to the Julio's question in the Q&A box? Okay, so
I think Hosu did it, right? So
yes, Hosik did, but if you want to add something else, but anyway, so thank you very much for all the panelists, and this was a very exciting and very a stimulating discussion, and I think I learned a lot, and I think the audience learned a lot, and I think there are lots of sort of a different perspective on how to see the international trade order different from the international security order, and but still there is a lot of opportunities and difficulties between Japan and the EU to collaborate and work for the WTO reform, and there are lots of issues to overcome with the current US administration. Well, of course, it was more or less much more difficult than the previous one, and also I think it is the big elephant in the room is China, and how we need to have the proper strategy to manage and manage whether it's a 3+1 format or we engage China like in the case of the Rcep. So I think it is there is a lot of rich seeds for discussion and further collaboration between EU and Japan, and I hope that this will continue to be discussed and in the various forums. So I thank everyone for the panel, and please give the big applause, although it's unfortunate that we can't hear the applause, but please give the big applause to the panelists. So I'll stop here. Thank you very much, and this is the end of the session. Thank you.